Call it an Olympic-sized gamble ahead of the big Chinese New Year holiday travel rush and the Winter Games that follow. Authorities there more than ever sticking to their zero COVID policy. As Omicron tears through much of the rest of the world, can the coronavirus really be barred from the Beijing Olympics? It's about much more than winter sports. More than 2 years after the first cases came out of China, fears over Omicron contagion, again highlighting just how much the rest of the planet depends on the country. Exports from China aren't the only issue. As the country's growth slowed to 4% in the last quarter, China watchers wondering about the impact of a construction sector with feet of clay and why consumer spending there has slowed more than expected. More broadly, what does the future hold for an aging population? In 2021, the birth rate slowed even faster. This despite the scrapping a few years back of that one-child policy. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at China in a bubble with this commentator and entrepreneur, André Lozekog-Petri, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, Francois.
The economist and China business consultant Jean-Paul Chang joins us as well. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
From Latvia's capital, Riga, Una Berzina Serenkova, head of the Chinese Studies Center at Riga Stratens University. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. It's a giant bubble that stretches nearly 200 kilometers in circumference. Organizers of the Beijing Games have ringed not only the area around the sporting venues and the Olympic Village that'll be home to 3,000 athletes, but also hotels for international media. The very first cases of Omicron have the capital more than ever on its guard.
Beijing is heading into the Winter Olympics facing the dual pressures of preventing the import of overseas cases and the resurgence of local infections. Departments at all levels should maintain a state of emergency and strengthen joint prevention and control.
André Lozekog-Petri, how are the Olympics going to go on that score?
Well, it's going to be very weird Olympics. Obviously, it's going to be much tighter than the last Tokyo Olympics, which was already in a bubble. And one can only say that the spirit of Olympism, which is all countries coming together, will be hard to find in the artificial snow over Beijing.
It won't be your usual Olympics, but will it be Olympics without Omicron?
Well, what I hear from all my friends who are in China is that the bubble that will contain the athletes and all the organizers in touch with them will be so strict that the athletes will have zero contacts whatsoever with the local population. They will need to be quarantined for 21 days if they're not fully vaccinated. So yes, the measures which are taken are extremely strict to avoid any kind of risk. So the zero COVID policy of that the Chinese government is probably one of the very few to still hold on a global basis is probably the only possible way to have that going forward. But one must also consider that Omicron is taking everybody by surprise since a couple of weeks due to its high contagious rates. And most countries in the West seem to be forgetting the capability of stopping it. So let's see what happens in Beijing. It's really a test for the organization capability of the CCP.
Una Berzina Serenkova, just how much is riding on these Winter Games for Xi Jinping?
Well, obviously a lot, and that's a good question. But I would like to also a little bit go back to the previous speaker and, to comment that I would say it's not all that bleak for China, however, because Olympics, what is it about? Why do we keep having them? If they're about positive emotions, and they do contain a very heavy load of positive emotions. With, countries cheering or populations cheering for their athletes. And China has that going for it. And boycotts are a part of it, of course, and rightfully so. But the athletes will still be there. And for the international audience, this is a little bit to come closer to your question. for China, it's beyond the current events. It's not about today's headlines of boycotts and Omicron. It's about linking the name of your city to what they hope will be some sort of a legendary event, legendary wins, legendary world records, drama even, legendary losses forever. And that is what China is gambling on to link back to the name of today's conversation. But that's for the international audience. Now, it's a cliche, of course, to speak about how important it is for Chinese leaders to, in fact, speak to the domestic audience. But it is only a cliche because it's true. So, again, the leadership, including Xi Jinping, will be using this event to demonstrate domestically how China is perceived as the strong presence internationally, how it's being praised. And we already see Xinhua coming out with these reports in Chinese. And by the way, to go back also to the already previously mentioned Tokyo Games, that's China's big advantage. They are not the first country to hold the Corona Olympics, right? They have a lot to learn, and they are learning from Tokyo. They're actually speaking about it. But of course, the big question and the big unknown is the Omicron. And how is that going to shake up China's plans?
How's it going to shake up China's plans? Jean-Paul Chang, the zero COVID policy, will they be able to maintain it once the games are over?
With relaxed content, I believe, because the principle of zero COVID policy would not change. But in the practical aspect of the life, you can notice already a lot of relaxation in the rules of controlling and testing people, and there have been some new measure dictated to all the regional leaders, officials, to ask them not to behave excessively in case of discovery of contamination, not to unnecessarily concentrated people impose unnecessary strict measures, etc., especially concerning regions and areas which are less likely being a serious area of contamination. So I believe that they will not change, of course, because they say that they proved already that this zero COVID policy maintained the Chinese growth in 2021 because they got an annual growth rate of 8.1 that makes the Chinese economy still the leading world economy in terms of growth. So they will not change that. But in the practical life, things could be a little bit more relaxed. You have to keep in mind two things. One is Omicron is less serious in terms of consequences, and the second is 86 to 87% of the Chinese population has been vaccinated fully.
All right, and vaccinated, we'll talk about that in a moment, but for now, the zero COVID policy officially stands. Just ask the 13 million folks in the central city of Xi'an, where lockdown restrictions are finally easing after 3 weeks. Radical restrictions, still they're popular for now. It's a France 24 report read by Oliver Farry.
Chinese people have been making a lot of sacrifices in the name of the country's zero COVID policy. There's no question for the Chinese government of living with the virus, and the policy has worked. Official deaths from COVID since the start of the pandemic stand at fewer than 6,000. At the earliest positive case, authorities lock down, test and trace. In the city of Chengdu, contact cases are identified using GPS data on their smartphones. Spending just 10 minutes within 800 metres of a positive case can land you in quarantine. In November, just 10 cases of COVID rendered 82,000 people contacts. Mass testing and quarantine are obligatory, measures the residents approve.
These measures are necessary because all lives are precious and must be protected.
It's a pain. My neighborhood was all locked down, but what else can you do?
It's to keep everyone safe and to prevent the virus from spreading. It's very effective.
But the effectiveness comes at a price, paralysing entire cities like in Xi'an in the northwest. After around 200 cases were detected on December 23rd, 13 million inhabitants were locked down until further notice. Unless it was for testing, people were forbidden from going outside, even for shopping. Residents have been supplied by neighbourhood committees, but authorities acknowledge problems with supply lines. On social media, citizens have been complaining of hunger. The fight against COVID remains the priority, with sometimes controversial methods that go so far as public humiliation. These four manacled men were accused of helping foreigners cross into China from Vietnam. Their pictures and names hanging around their necks, they were marched through the streets as an example by police. The parade of shame drew condemnation from internet users and even state media. But critics of the zero-COVID policy are rare, even if it is likely to affect China's economic growth this year. One exception was this eminent virologist interviewed on Hong Kong TV.
We shouldn't systematically carry out mass testing. If the government persists with the zero-COVID policy for a handful of cases, I think the economy will suffer.
And Chinese authorities say the extreme contagiousness of the Omicron variant shows that they are right.
Some countries reacted very quickly when a few Omicron cases were detected, imposing very strict measures. Our experience over the past 2 years showed the Chinese method is the right one.
And confronted with Omicron, that method could get more robust. A challenge for foreign businesses in China who struggle to recruit abroad. Visa allocations have been reduced to a trickle, and more expatriates are leaving a country cut off from the world.
And you were saying just before that report, Jean-Paul Chang, how there's signs of easing up in already in less densely populated areas. Again, how much political capital has been spent by being so strict?
Yeah, the price is, of course, in terms of popularity, because take the case of Xi'an. Xi'an city's administration has been criticized and mocked, not by the Xi'an people, but by the rest of China. So on the Chinese social networks, you can find a lot of mockeries, and comparing the situation for Xi'an to this of Shanghai, for example. Shanghai has some case of Omicron as well, but the approach is much more expert-led. They are listening more to experts than to the officials. The officials don't speak all the time, don't take the decision without taking the advice of a medical expert. And also the approach has been very soft and fine-tuning in Shanghai. So, it's also a problem of the unequal quality of the governance in different parts of China. So right now, because of this New Year's approach, when you have 700 million of people who are going to travel,
yeah, they call
the country,
it the Great Migration.
The central government. Yeah, exactly. And they gave some directive orders to say that, okay, for people traveling from less dangerous zone, you don't have to concentrate them, to put them in quarantine. Don't force people to stay at home. Don't go to the house to check, to put limit on their daily life, etc. So all this is just, it's going on at the same time that they maintain the official doctrine of zero COVID.
Yeah, and what's giving the whole planet jitters, you mentioned Shanghai there, is when Omicron hits major commercial hubs and particularly port cities. Like Tianjin, population 14 million, it's home to Volkswagen and Toyota car factories that were shut last week. Mandatory testing's been imposed there. China boasts 7 of the world's 10 biggest ports. And that's not counting Hong Kong. Here you see the map of ports that are of particular concern when we're talking about Omicron. The West, Japan, they rely on all the stuff that's exported out of those ports. Andre Lozakyug-Petri, you were with us 2 years ago when we first heard of this coronavirus, and back then we were realizing just how much the rest of the world relies on China. It seems like that when you look at that map of ports, it looks like it's more than before.
Yeah, definitely, because China continued to grow pretty massively in the last 2 years, and so the dependency has increased. It's just now much more visible. So that's at least the wake-up call that happened in the West, in particular, about the dependency on all supply chains. I mean, we focused on so-called high-end, high-added value products. But we realize today that vertical integration, that means controlling also your suppliers and intermediary goods, is critical too, especially if they need to travel through ports that can be shut down by a single case, either in Tianjin or in Shanghai or in Ningbo.
Okay, so right now we have these supply chains disruptions that are already happening. Stories like, for instance, about the Port of Los Angeles going to 24 hours a day so they can keep up, because right now the supply is not meeting demand. If Omicron hits hard in those port cities in China, what impact on places like France, Germany, the United States?
Well, it's going to be significant. We could see that the disruption affected already a lot of industries. Think about automotive. Think about also healthcare goods. I mean, we saw that with masks initially and things like that. I mean, just to come back on the previous point. I mean, today we see how much this virus, this pandemic became political. Because number one, the Chinese vaccine is less efficient on Omicron. And so the zero COVID policy is actually the only way for the Chinese government to keep some kind of a feeling that they still have the control. Because what we see in our countries where Omicron is less dangerous for severe cases might not be, for those vaccinated, might not be the case in China. So there is a little bit of a political clash here, which makes me worry, is that probably the government will continue on this policy, which has a huge economic toll. And we will talk about that, I suppose, a bit later on the latest economic data, which finally show that these restrictions are hitting the Chinese economy badly. And if the Chinese economy is badly hit, not just the supply chain will have a consequence on us, but it's the whole growth machine, the whole recovery of the global economy that will be affected. So it's concerning.
Una Berzina-Sarankova, is the zero COVID policy to make up for the fact that Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine against COVID, isn't as effective as those we have here in the West?
Well, yes, it's hard for me to comment on immunology issues, but it would seem that way. What I want to come back to, if you allow me, is I think that Jean-Paul made an absolutely fascinating point in his intervention about the decentralization of these decisions when it comes to lockdowns in China. And so to go back to your question that you just discussed regarding the ports, whether Omicron and the zero COVID policy has the potential to absolutely stop the traffic, I wonder if that also depends on the local government. Of course, we have the port cities that are directly subordinated to the central government, and that's Shanghai and Tianjin. But at the same time, there are such port cities as Ningbo who are kind of the underdogs in a way, who are trying to compete with these big ports in their own country. And their local governments are very hungry for that. So we might just see, following Jean-Paul's logic, we might just see that they are more bold when it comes to, or rather, make less stringent policies when it comes to zero COVID. But that's just a guess on my side.
China, as Andre and Jean-Paul were saying, announcing this Monday a growth rate which has slowed to 4% in the last quarter. It's 8% over the year. It's down, but slightly higher than the 3.8% that was forecast. What's more alarming is we're showing this graph here, which has retail trade inside of China, which has dipped. So that means consumers spending less. Is Xi Jinping's pivot from exports to domestic consumer-driven economy stalling, Jean-Paul Chang?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I believe it's already impact for the fourth quarter, at least, impact of this COVID situation. When you
so why are Chinese citizens spending less money?
Because they're not going out, because they're being locked down, and also could be when you are worrying about the future, you are spending less. I mean, sometimes, and but in terms of a macroeconomy, actually the household income increased in 2021, and I believe that they are going to have a big spending time during the New Year's festival. And after that, no, I mean it's not so significant. They took there've been some measures also, specific measure against the corruption in the e-commerce promoters. The people have been fined because they were not paying the tax accordingly to the law. We all learn some high-profile case of e-commerce promoters being punished, and all this impact somehow on the consumption. But I don't think it's a lasting trend. The trend of the domestic consumption continuing to grow is not changing really over one quarter. You cannot just make a conclusion too fast.
Can't make a conclusion too fast. COVID oblige, the World Economic Forum in Davos, again going virtual this year. This Monday, it was Xi Jinping's turn to speak, the Chinese president, from a virtual standpoint, assuring investors that the future remains bright.
China will wholeheartedly promote reform and open up. We are already doing this. No matter the international context, China will hold high the banner of reform and open up.
Andre Lozikyug-Petri, you heard Jean-Paul Chang there, and you heard Af talk about how this is normal for now, but it's gonna, what goes down will go up. And you heard Xi Jinping. What does Xi Jinping mean when he talks about the opening up of China?
It's increasingly complicated to rationalize about it, because this discourse has been the same by Chinese leaders for now decades, and since now 6 or 7 years, this opening up policy is faced with a harsh reality that it's increasingly complicated for foreign companies to do business. 6 or 7 years ago, it was about the non-tariff barriers that were highlighted by a lot of the local chambers of commerce, the US or the European ones. Now it's very practically that you cannot get talent anymore coming into the countries, or the foreign expats who are basically isolated from the rest of the world since 2 years don't necessarily want to stay there. And the attractivity of a big country, of a superpower, is also fueled by its capacity to attract the best. So on the opening up, I think there's increasingly doubts that that's a reality. It's maybe a reality for Chinese companies wanting to expand overseas, but it's less and less the case for.
And what about the pivot? The pivot from an export-driven economy to one that encourages domestic consumer spending?
That's happening. That's happening because the reserve of this middle class is still almost a never-ending gold mine, because you have this expansion. Jean-Paul mentioned that very eloquently before. You have an expansion of this middle class that a couple of years ago was 200 million people, that now is 300, 400, 500 million, and that will still continue to expand. So the consumption growth will continue. But what is also true is that the Chinese government has been consistently trying to stop the overheating of the economy, which was a problem 2 years ago. And one topic that was not mentioned is the way it systematically went against the real estate bubble, because you can call it as such. And let's not forget, for a lot of households, the wealth feeling you had from seeing all your apartments' wealth going up was also fueling the consumer spending. So since now prices are capping or even going down, and look at all the problems a lot of big real estate developers had, some consumers will be a bit more careful before spending. So that might be another reason why we see this slump, and that might actually last more than a quarter.
Is that a big problem, Jean-Paul Chang, when we see the recent debacle at the country's second biggest real estate conglomerate, Evergrande?
No, I don't think so. And all my friends working in the banking business and financing don't believe that it's a very serious matter. The Chinese government still have a full range of means to adjust their economic policy. In terms of course, in terms of openness, I just want to add that the regional comprehensive economic partnership just came into force this year, and you have Japan, South Korea, and China as three leading economies in this partnership, and it's going to boost the interregional exchange, including creating probably new chain of manufacturing, chain of values. And I believe this is a continuation of the opening that Xi Jinping was mentioning. On the other side, you notice that Central Bank of China just lowered the benchmark interest rate for the medium-term loan by 10 basis points. But it is very significant. That means that they are again encouraging investment in fixed income. By the way, you have 102 mega projects in the 14th 5 years plan, and they were scheduled for later. But one way for the Chinese government to stimulate the Chinese economy is to advance the opening of this mega project. So they have a lot of means,
a lot of tools at their disposal.
The Chinese growth.
Una Brzezinska-Serenkova, sitting in Riga, do you get the sense that China's opening up or shutting down?
Well, the one thing that COVID, in my opinion, brought out from China is the answer to your question, which is yes. Yes to both. Why? Because what China is doing is it's promoting the domestic international dual circulation model right now. And that started appearing in Politburo conversations in 2020, I believe, center of 2020, middle. And it's also in the 14th five-year plan. And the idea is to harness this domestic market to alleviate the national dependence on exports, but at the same time, not to lose this position that China has in the international market. So this is kind of, we will sell to you, right? In this big circle, we will sell to you, and we're good with this. We're good with cooperation. But if you do something, or if something happens in this Chinese narrative about the world becoming a less and less stable place, we have where to go. We have this huge internal market. And if anyone can pull it up, then China can, obviously. And that is a huge issue, in my opinion, because the cornerstone, what's baked into the liberal system is this codependency, right? So I do something and then we're codependent, and you buy from me, I sell to you. We both want to keep it going. But this kind of this idea of dual circulation, it takes out this reciprocity from the process, and it gives China, leverage at the end of the day. So, and we know that China is not above using economic means when it comes to making a political point. The case of Australia and most recently Lithuania comes to mind, especially when it comes to Chinese core interests, right? So that is quite an issue. But just a quick word on Evergrande, if you allow me, because, just like we exist in Twitter bubbles here, we also, China watchers, we exist in Weixin bubbles in China. And my Weixin bubble, the reaction of the people who exist within my bubble in China was, who are these people who are suffering from the Evergrande crisis? Who are these people who are buying 4 apartments in China today, whereas here I am paying off my loan for a small 2-bedroom apartment in an old building? But that's the academics for you. That's maybe a different circle.
This idea about an expanding middle class, but there's also an aging population, and we got the latest proof of it with the statistics that have come in for 2021. Another record low birth rate in China. Sharon Gaffney has that story.
Chinese authorities had hoped that easing one of the world's strictest family planning regulations would lead to a baby boom. Instead, they're grappling with the case of the baby blues and a looming demographic crisis. Analysts warn that China's rapidly aging workforce could hamper economic growth due to labour shortages and decreasing tax revenues. The official birth rate has plummeted to a historic low, falling from 8.52 to 7.52 births per 1,000 people within the space of a year. 12 million babies were born in 2020, while just over 10.5 million births were registered last year. It comes as Beijing tries to encourage couples to have more children after 4 decades of doing the opposite. Introduced in the 1980s, the controversial one-child policy was relaxed in 2016 and replaced with a 2-child limit. Since last year, married couples have been allowed to have 3 babies. But many say they don't want more children, citing concerns about the high cost of living, as well as a lack of childcare facilities and workplace protections for women. In a bid to boost both marriage and birth rates, some regional authorities are now offering cash rewards and longer maternity leave, as well as matchmaking events and the scrapping of dowries. But with nearly 1 in 5 Chinese aged 60 or over, some experts say the population, the world's largest, may have already peaked and could soon start to shrink.
Una Brzezina Zarenkova, you heard Jean-Paul Chang say how China's still got a lot of tools at its disposal. Does it have a lot of tools to tackle this one, the aging population?
Well, certainly we see that the Chinese central government has approached boosting the population count and making it younger with the same rigor and the same vigor as it approached the contrary measure, which was caused by this faulty Malthusian type thinking. And I think the French development economist Philippe Agnon has written about it extensively, that this logic that in order to get rich, we need to curb population. But as we see, once the middle class emerges, they don't want to have as many kids. And this is where it's not so much about the Chinese government. It doesn't matter what they do, in fact, because we see that even the governments who are extremely investing in population growth. For example, well, I'm not sure about France, but I can, speak about my native Latvia, is that the government is all over trying to boost birth by economic measures, workplace measures. But at the same time, that is the issue of the global middle class, and especially so in China, where it is kind of a society with the expectation for high achievement. It's not enough to just have the kids. They have to achieve. And that's why being a parent is stressful. I'm not telling you anything new, I guess. And another thing that is very pertinent in China, but also in other big societies, is that having children, there's a huge difference whether it's 1 kid or 2 or 3. Why? Because when you have the 1 kid, you kind of already, you scratch that itch. You have that child, you've done that. But having more children means multiplying these costs. They're adding up, but the parent's income or parent's time is not adding up. So this means that political systems aside, in fact, it's the global middle class village. We're very much alike. And I don't think the Chinese government has a lot to do about it.
André Lezekirk-Pietri, You and I grew up hearing how, to quote the title of a Günter Grass book, the Germans are dying out. Their birth rate is low there. What we found in the last decade or two is that Germany has a stopgap measure. It's called immigration. Is that the future for China?
Well, that's eminently political. Obviously, Germany solved its issue. I mean, that was one of the reasons behind the very generous gesture of Merkel when she opened up the gates in 2015 to 1 million immigrants. And you all remember that big industry in Germany was actually promoting and supporting that move. Will we see the same? I mean, the logic would have led Japan 2 weeks ago, another Asian country, to have done the same since 2 or 3 decades, and they definitely didn't do it because of cultural reasons. What will happen in China is completely unknown. But you cannot underestimate the vast also amount of the Chinese diaspora. There were already a few attempts to try to have some come back, especially the scientists and the well-educated ones to come back. So all is possible. What is sure is that the complexity of these issues and the interconnection of political, economic, and demographic issues make Xi Jinping probably very convinced that he needs to remain and have a hard grip on everything which happens. So it's going to be interesting years ahead.
We're a final word because we're out of time. Jean-Paul Chang?
China is approaching a critical point because if you take the number of births and you subtract the number of deaths, natural deaths, China added only less than 600,000 people for a country of 1.4 billion. It's a big problem. So we're approaching the point that I believe the Chinese government is going to act especially on the social side, by economic supporting measure to encourage people to have more children.
And will it work with that as it joins that global middle class that Una Bergina Serenkova was describing? We shall see. I want to thank you, Una, for joining us from Riga. I want to thank Jean-Paul Chang, André Lezekug-Pietri. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.